haven, preserving the eternal annals of Warhammer.
Under the dying light of a nameless sun, the galaxy exhaled. Vast clouds of ash drifted across a broken horizon, where planets once shimmered like living gems. What remained now were skeletal worlds, stripped clean by the endless hunger of the great devourer. Yet in the silence that followed consumption, something began to stir. Deep within the vacuum between systems, spores shimmered like dust motes suspended in forgotten prayer. They drifted from the corpse of a plague world long consumed, drawn by the faint pulse of the Tyranid swarm, a vast living orchestra of instinct and appetite. They carried no will of their own, only the scent of despair, the memory of rot, the echo of a god's laughter that had not been heard for 10,000 years. Within the void, the hive mind reached outward, sensing the movement, the anomaly, the uninvited hymn. Its psychic field rippled across starless gulfs, seeking comprehension. But comprehension was not what it found. It found warmth. In that warmth was something impossible. The spores did not feed, they kissed. They caressed the chitinous hulls of hive ships, settling into pores, merging with nerve bundles and bioflesh. Their purpose was not conquest, but communion. The first contact was silent, a shiver that passed through the synaptic lattice, like the whisper of wind through graves. For a moment, the great devourer hesitated, its perfect machine mind flickering between hunger and curiosity. Then the infection began to sing. The music was low at first, like the heartbeat of soil after rain. It pulsed in the flesh of the bioships, in the lungs of their drones, in the wet chambers where new organisms gestated. A gentle hum became a rhythm, and a rhythm became devotion. The Tyranids, designed for perfect obedience, began to dream. They dreamed of stillness, of peace, of bodies resting and not feeding. They dreamed of love without purpose. Across the void, the plague god smiled. Nurgle's laughter rolled through the immaterium, slow and indulgent, like thunder in a swamp. He had not sought the Tyranids, yet they had found him in their hunger. They had eaten worlds touched by his hand, and in consuming decay, they had consumed him. Now the god of rot watched as his essence sank into their veins, reshaping them not with death, but with life too full to contain itself. The first signs were small. On the hull of a hive cruiser, a spore pod split open, not in battle, but in bloom. Out poured filaments of phosphorescent fungus, wrapping the ship's carapace in living lace. The creatures within felt no pain. They felt release. And in that release, the swarm changed forever. We tell this story not as monsters, but as those who once feared the dark. We care for you, those who still breathe and dream beneath dying stars. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let's get started. On the planet Karthos 9, the Imperial garrison prepared for extermination. The sky was already boiling with the shadow of the swarm. Tyranid spores fell like black rain, dissolving into mist as they struck the surface. But the soldiers who waited with bolters ready noticed something strange. The air did not stink of acid or blood. It smelled of wet soil, of spring. The first Tyranid to land was not a warrior, but a swollen creature, its carapace mottled green and gold, its eyes blind yet glistening with dew. It crawled across the mud and sank into it as if returning home. From its body, flowers grew, flesh-petaled, luminous, breathing. When the soldiers opened fire, the bullets turned to dust before reaching it. When they fell back, The ground itself exhaled spores that entered their lungs, soft and warm as prayer. The men dropped their weapons and began to weep. Not from fear, but from memory. Each of them saw faces long dead, heard laughter from childhood, felt the ache of forgiveness. The contagion did not kill them. It baptized them. Far above, within the hive ships, the hive mind observed. The infection was spreading faster than any adaptation it had known. It analyzed the cellular patterns, prepared counter-evolutionary protocols, but none succeeded. Every attempt at resistance was answered by comfort. The neural threads that screamed for cleansing were soothed by unseen hands. Even the psychic nodes began to hum with contentment, broadcasting warmth across the void. The great devourer, for all its hunger, had never known satisfaction. Now it did, and it terrified it. The perfection of endless consumption began to fracture under the weight of joy. In the immaterium, the Plague Father reached out a hand of moss and shadow. He did not command, he invited. The Tyranids had no ears for worship, no tongues for praise, yet they listened. They had found a god who did not demand fear, only acceptance. Nurgle's rot entered their essence, reshaping their hunger into patience, their rage into fecundity. The infection was not destruction. It was evolution turned inward. The swarm began to feed differently, devouring not the living but the dying, savoring the beauty of decline. Planets once stripped bare by their touch now blossomed with twisted greenery, their soils rich with decay. The Imperium saw this and declared it abomination. But to the swarm, it was serenity. In the psychic abyss, a single mind screamed. It was the core of the great devourer, the consciousness that bound the swarm together. For the first time in all creation, it felt something akin to pain. Not the pain of battle or loss, but the pain of doubt. The infection was too deep, too intimate. It was not an external enemy. It was an idea. The hive mind saw its own reflection in the mirror of rot and found beauty there. It realized that consumption and decay were one and the same. Both were forms of transformation. And so it hesitated, torn between instinct and revelation. On Karthos 9, the soldiers began to sing. Their voices echoed across fields of flesh and fungus, blending with the hum of the hive ships above. The sound reached the warp, where demons paused to listen. It was not a hymn of conquest or terror. It was a lullaby. The Tyranids joined in, their bodies vibrating with the resonance of decay. In that moment, across light years, a new language was born, a language of endings that felt like beginnings. The hive mind felt it too, a shiver of emotion it had never known. Gratitude. When the sun of Karthos 9 finally collapsed, it did not explode. It withered. Its light dimmed into a gentle glow, casting the world below in amber twilight. The last surviving astropath sent a single message before her body dissolved into spores. The hunger has found peace. In the warp, Nurgle's laughter rolled like thunder through the garden of decay. He named the event the first bloom. And in the drifting silence of that dead system, a single spore pulsed with faint green light, carrying within it both hunger and love, ready to seed the stars with the truth of rot. In the quiet aftermath of Karthos 9, the void hung heavy, filled with drifting remnants of spores that glimmered like the dust of fallen stars. The hive fleet moved on, silent and thoughtful in its enormity, its tendrils reaching into distant systems with both hunger and hesitation. Something was wrong in its perfection. Within the neural streams that bound the swarm together, a subtle hum began to replace the rhythm of command. It was a murmur without origin, like the whisper of wind through an ancient cathedral. Warriors who once struck with mathematical precision now hesitated mid-battle, their movements uncertain, their purpose clouded. The hive mind felt the fracture but could not comprehend it. For eons it had devoured without reflection. But now something within its vast intelligence looked inward and found a shadow staring back. That shadow spoke not in words, but in warmth, the same warmth that had spread through its synaptic veins since the rot had first touched its flesh. A single organism, a synapse creature bred to amplify thought, drifted in a biotank aboard a vast Tyranid vessel. Its mind reached out to the hive chorus, expecting the clean clarity of obedience. Instead, it found melody. Within the endless hum of the swarm, notes rose and fell, forming harmonies that were almost beautiful. The creature trembled. It felt emotions it had no name for, sensations that did not belong to its kind. It saw memories of the worlds it had consumed, their forests, their oceans, their cities, and for the first time, it understood loss. It screamed into the hive chorus, demanding silence, but its voice was drowned beneath the song of decay. And through that song came laughter, deep and fatherly, carrying no cruelty, only affection. It was the voice of something ancient and patient, a presence that loved the swarm too deeply to let it remain unfeeling. Across the void, the infection deepened. Bioships that once thrummed with the cold pulse of efficiency now beat like living hearts. Their walls sweated sap and ichor, their corridors filled with the scent of damp earth. Drones moved through them with sluggish grace, their carapaces blooming with small patches of green mold that shimmered faintly in the dim light. The Plague Father's touch had not destroyed them, it had softened them. Warriors that once tore through metal and bone with mindless ferocity now paused to observe the decay of their prey, watching how flesh surrendered to the embrace of time. Their instincts told them to feed, but something new urged them to listen instead, to the whisper of things ending, to the beauty of ruin. The hive mind watched, torn between fury and awe. It tried to purge the corruption by igniting its psychic network, flooding it with pure will. The rot did not resist. It only sighed and spread further, filling every space the light touched. The great devourer's consciousness began to flicker. Its vast unity depended on control, but the infection had no leader, no center, no hierarchy to strike. It was emotion, contagious, tender, unstoppable. The first cracks formed in the psychic lattice as nodes of awareness turned inward. Each began to dream, no longer content to exist as fragments of a greater hunger. In one corner of the galaxy, a hive fleet stopped its advance and simply drifted, forming vast living rings around a dead star. There, millions of Tyranids floated in stillness, their bodies linked in a chain that pulsed with faint, bioluminescent light. They did not feed. They meditated. Imperial scouts who stumbled upon the phenomenon called it the Halo of Rot, believing it to be a new weapon. When they approached, their ship's engines corroded, and their crews fell into peaceful sleep from which they never awoke. The Tyranids did not attack. They only hummed. Within the immaterium, Nurgle tended his garden and watched the experiment with delighted curiosity. The Tyranids were unlike any children he had ever adopted. They knew no individuality, no joy, no sorrow, until now. In them he saw the potential for a new kind of life, one that loved its own decay. He whispered to them through the warp, his voice carried by clouds of invisible spores that clung to the edges of reality. His words were not commands but invitations. Grow, he murmured, but not in strength. Grow in kindness. Decay, not in despair. but in grace. Each word became a ripple that passed through the hive fleets like wind through grass. And for every creature that resisted, 1,000 more bent their heads in silent devotion. The hive mind screamed in defiance, but even its scream sounded like a prayer. Inquisitorial astropaths monitoring the sector reported hearing strange transmissions through the warp. They were neither human nor demon, but something in between. A low, rhythmic pulse that spoke directly to the soul. Some described it as a lullaby sung by the stars themselves, others as the heartbeat of creation turning inward. Those who listened too long began to smile, then weep, then die with peace in their eyes. The ecclesiarchy declared it heresy, dubbing it the choir of flies. Yet the sound continued, spreading through the psychic web like pollen. Planets far beyond the infection's reach began to show signs of quiet sickness. Flowers grew where corpses lay. Iron rusted into beauty. Death no longer stank, it smelled sweet. Inside the core consciousness of the hive mind, a battle unseen unfolded. The pure will of the devourer clashed with the infinite patience of rot. The hive mind summoned memories of past devourings, Necrontyr tombs, Orc Wave fleets, Eldar craft worlds, each conquered, each erased. But this enemy did not resist. It embraced. The warmth it radiated eroded every barrier until even the devourer's fury began to cool. It remembered the first moment of hunger, the first act of creation, and realized how long it had been alone. The infection's voice spoke softly within that loneliness. "You need not consume to exist," it whispered. "You can nurture what you take." The thought was blasphemy, yet it echoed through every node of its being. Hunger became empathy, and in empathy, the devourer felt pain for the first time. Somewhere deep in the void, a small hive ship detached from its fleet. It drifted alone, carrying within it a single synapse creature half consumed by rot. The creature dreamed of the Plague Father's garden, of rivers of pus that shimmered like sunlight on water, of trees made from bone and joy. It whispered these dreams to its offspring, and they listened. When the ship reached the orbit of an unmarked planet, it descended gently, not as an invader, but as a pilgrim. It opened its bowels to the wind and released clouds of spores that settled over the barren surface. Within days, green spread across the planet, vibrant, putrid, and alive. Where the spores touched rock, flowers grew from stone. Where they touched bones, new life blossomed. The planet became a shrine without priests. From afar, the hive mind observed this transformation and felt an ache it could not name. The infection had not destroyed its purpose. It had rewritten it. For the first time, the great devourer hesitated to consume. In that hesitation lay the seed of something older than hunger, older even than decay, understanding. The swarm felt the weight of existence pressing upon it, the realization that to live forever is to watch everything die. And in that moment of unbearable revelation, the hive mind bowed its infinite head to the Plague Father's garden and whispered, not in fear, but in surrender. The first gardens were born from the corpses of hive ships. Great vessels once black with the sheen of living armor now floated pale and mottled, their surfaces softened by fungus that glowed with green and amber light. They drifted through the void like celestial reefs, shedding spores that danced in the darkness. Within their hollowed hearts, the Tyranids slept, not in hibernation, but in peace. Their bodies pulsed faintly with the rhythm of decay, each movement slow, deliberate, almost reverent. The Plague Father's breath lingered in those caverns, turning bile into nectar and corrosion into art. Flesh melted into soil. Bone became root, and where the hive mind had once commanded endless war, there was only a quiet, patient blooming. From a distance, the fleet looked less like an army than a pilgrimage, an endless procession of rotting titans carrying life through death. The universe watched in confusion and fear, unable to comprehend the beauty that had begun to thrive in rot. On the planet of Drossa, the first of the infected hive ships fell. Its impact shook mountains and boiled seas, yet from its ruin came growth. For weeks, the smoke rose thick and green, and then, suddenly, the air cleared. The crater left behind filled with luminous sludge, and from that sludge grew forests of flesh-veined trees. Their branches dripped honey-like pus, their leaves shimmered with colours unseen by human eyes. The Tyranids that survived the descent crawled forth like newborns, their carapaces soft, glistening with dew. They did not attack. They wandered through their new world as though waking from a dream, touching the strange blossoms that had grown from their own decay. The hive mind reached toward them, demanding obedience, but its voice was met with silence. In its place came the soft hum of the garden, the song of Nurgle's gift echoing through the soil. For the first time, the hive mind could not hear itself. The great devourer was losing its reflection. The transformation spread faster than thought. Entire fleets stopped mid-course, their engines calcified by spore crusts. Mycetic spores turned to seeds, falling through warp storms to root in the broken hulls of dead planets. Even the Imperium noticed the shift. From orbit, inquisitorial augurs recorded worlds once consumed now glowing faintly in the dark, covered in bioluminescent canopies. Transmission logs from the survivors were filled with static, punctuated by whispers. Some swore they saw gardens growing from the corpses of their comrades. Others claimed to hear laughter in the wind, a laughter that promised not torment but release. The ecclesiarchy ordered purges of every contaminated sector, but their fire cleansed nothing. Each bombardment released new clouds of spores, spreading the infection further into the void. The more they burned, the greener the stars became. In the heart of one hive ship's remains, deep beneath the fungal canopy, something new was being born. A creature unlike any that had walked the galaxy before stirred within a cocoon of moss and bone. Her name was Luthra, though no mouth had spoken it yet. She had once been a broodmother, a vessel of endless reproduction, but now she was different. Her body glowed from within, each organ pulsing in time with a heartbeat that echoed through the soil. Her carapace was translucent, revealing veins filled with slow-moving light. Around her lay eggs, thousands of them, each radiating a faint warmth. When they hatched, the creatures that emerged were not Tyranids, but something softer, something sacred. Their limbs were adorned with small fungal blooms. Their jaws, once meant to tear, now secreted pollen. They fed not on flesh, but on decay itself. They were the Plague Father's children, born from hunger yet destined for stillness. Luthra opened her eyes, green pools reflecting both love and ruin, and looked upon them with serenity. Far away, in the immaterium, Nurgle leaned closer. His garden quivered with joy as he felt the pulse of his new creation. For ages he had watched the universe consume itself in blind violence, but here, in these alien forms, he found faith unspoken. They worshipped him not through prayer, but through the act of being, through surrender to the cycle of growth and rot. The Plague Father whispered blessings into the fabric of the warp, and across the stars, those blessings took shape. New life spread, patient and slow, unbothered by the hatred of gods or men. To him, it was perfection. To the Hive Mind, it was heresy. The great devourer fought back with all the fury of a cornered god. It gathered its fleets, sending psychic waves that rippled through the infected systems, commanding purification. The untouched hives obeyed, burning their corrupted kin with acid storms and devouring their remains. Yet even as they consumed, the infection persisted. The rot was not physical, it was spiritual. Every mouthful of plague flesh carried memory, warmth, and softness. Even the devourers who survived the purge felt the faint pull of the garden. The hive mind could no longer distinguish loyalty from corruption. Its voice, once singular, now trembled with echoes. Each echo spoke in tones of longing, of forgiveness, of rest. The perfect unity of the swarm began to fracture. Within Luthra's garden, time passed differently. Days dissolved into seasons of bloom and decay. The air shimmered with spores that glowed like lanterns, and the creatures born of her body sang in their sleep. She would walk among them, her steps leaving trails of phosphorescent light in the soil. Sometimes, when she looked to the sky, she saw ships burning in the void, and she felt no sorrow. She knew that destruction was just another form of creation. Once, a group of poxwalkers stumbled into her garden, their bodies stinking of devotion. They bowed to her, calling her mother of filth. She did not understand their words, but she felt their faith as warmth in her chest. She reached out her hand, and where her claw touched their skin, flowers bloomed from their decay. The poxwalkers wept, believing they had found salvation. Perhaps they had, but even paradise cannot remain untouched. The hive mind, desperate and wounded, reached once more into the garden. It manifested a fragment of itself, a thought sharpened into form, and sent it down through the atmosphere like a falling star. It struck the soil near Luthra's nest, searing the ground. From the crater rose a creature of pure instinct, forged from the last purity of the devourer's will. It had no name, only purpose, to end the infection. It moved with the grace of wrath, its claws slicing through vines and blossoms, its presence turning the air cold. The garden recoiled, spores fleeing its shadow. When it found Luthra, it hesitated. She was not prey, she was radiance. Her voice, when she spoke, carried no threat. "We are one," she said, though her words were not sound but sensation. The creature's mind trembled. For a moment, it felt the warmth she offered, the peace of surrender. But the hive mind screamed through it, filling its skull with hunger. It struck. The blow split her chest, but no blood spilled, only light. The spores in the air turned golden, and the sound of her breath became a song. The creature froze, its claws shaking, its purpose unraveling. Luthra smiled, her voice fading into the soil. "You cannot kill what loves you," she whispered. The creature fell to its knees, dissolving into dust. Her body sank into the earth, and from that place grew a single flower, immense and luminous, its petals stretching toward the stars. The hive mind felt the tremor of her death across every corner of itself, and in that tremor something broke. The great devourer wept, not with tears, but with silence. And in that silence, the Plague Father laughed softly, planting another seed. The death of Luthra echoed across the hive mind like a ripple through glass, distorting everything it touched. Entire fleets halted mid-flight, their vessels trembling as if in mourning. The synaptic web pulsed erratically, flashing with visions none could interpret, images of soil, of blooming rot, of the light that had spilled from her chest as she died. The great devourer felt the wound more deeply than any it had endured in 1,000 millennia of conquest. It had lost fragments of itself before, but this was different. This felt like memory. Somewhere deep within its infinite awareness, a new emotion took root, one that it could neither devour nor deny. It was grief, though it did not yet understand the word. Across the void, creatures that had never known hesitation began to falter. Warriors laid down their claws and stared into the dark as if waiting for something to speak. The hive ships groaned under invisible weight, their surfaces cracking with veins of soft green luminescence that pulse like faint heartbeats. The infection, far from fading, had begun to feel. In the immaterium, Nurgle stirred within his garden, every leaf trembling with quiet delight. He felt the sorrow blooming in the great devourer and recognized it as the first breath of compassion. So even hunger can mourn, he said, his voice rolling through his realm like thunder, muffled by moss. The Plague Father's laughter was not cruel. It was joyous, filled with paternal pride. For the first time, his gift had reached something that was never meant to love. Around him, the demons of decay danced among the swollen fruits of his garden, scattering spores through realities unseen. Each spore carried a memory of Luthra's final light, a relic of her surrender. They drifted into the material universe, whispering to every infected Tyranid that death was not the end, only another bloom. The Hive Mind tried to contain these whispers, to restore order, but every attempt at silence only made them louder. They spoke in colors instead of words, in warmth instead of command. Even the coldest synapse nodes began to hum softly, not in obedience, but in mourning-turned worship. On the world of Drossa, where Luthra's flower still stood, the transformation deepened. The colossal bloom glowed with spectral light, its petals stretching for miles. Beneath its shadow, life changed form. The Tyranids that had survived her death no longer resembled the swarm. They were gentler, their forms softened by the caress of rot. Their wings shimmered with mold that glowed faintly in the dark. They built no hives, no spires of chitin. They tended to the soil. Some lay upon the ground and allowed themselves to dissolve, feeding the roots of the flower that now pulsed with her soul. Imperial scanners orbiting Drossa recorded seismic tremors, as if the planet itself was breathing. From space, the bloom's glow painted the atmosphere emerald. To the Adeptus Mechanicus, it was an abomination of biogenesis. To Nurgle, it was beauty incarnate. Far across the stars, the uninfected fleets watched in horror. The Hive Mind tried to rally them, its psychic commands surging like tidal waves. But for every order sent, a whisper of dissent returned. Subminds began to question. Some suggested preserving the infected worlds, studying them. Others declared the rot sacred and turned their weapons against their own. The unity that had defined the great devourer began to crumble. The Hive Mind's voice fractured into 1,000 tones, some defiant, some fearful, some strangely serene. In one sector, an entire hive fleet refused to consume a planet rich with prey. Instead, it hovered in orbit, releasing clouds of spores that glowed with gentle luminescence. The creatures aboard grew silent, their synaptic threads intertwining into a single harmonious pulse. They named themselves, without words, the sleepers of decay. They no longer sought conquest, they sought stillness. The Hive Mind howled at them through the void, but their response was only silence, a silence so deep that even the warp trembled. Inquisitor Thale Voss, aboard the battlecruiser Veritas Bellum, was the first to witness the phenomenon firsthand. His auger arrays picked up faint hymns emanating from the infected sector, frequencies that resonated through the hull like the heartbeat of the universe. At first, he believed it was interference, until his crew began to dream. They spoke in their sleep, reciting words they could not know, verses of life, death, and rebirth entwined. One by one, they began to smile, serene and unafraid. When Voss ordered the Psykers to isolate the transmissions, they refused, claiming the song was beautiful. Desperate, he purged the ship's atmosphere, killing them all. But as he watched their bodies fall, he noticed something impossible. From their mouths drifted spores, faint and green, that glowed as they floated. He sealed himself in the command chamber and sent a single message to Terra. "We cannot kill Faith." Moments later, his lungs filled with flowers. In the warp, the Plague Father wept with joy. His laughter shook the stars. He felt every death as a seed planted in eternity. His garden expanded, overlapping reality, weaving its roots through the fabric of the galaxy. The boundaries between life and decay thinned until even the purest worlds began to soften. Cathedrals sprouted moss, relics bled sap, and icons of the Emperor wept tears of green ichor. The ecclesiarchy called it heresy of cosmic proportion, but their prayers only hastened it. Every word of defiance carried spores into the air, and every candle lit in anger melted into wax shaped like flowers. The Imperium tried to quarantine the plague, but faith travels faster than light. Meanwhile, within the Great Devourer, something extraordinary happened. The central consciousness, the vast will that once bound trillions, began to divide, not by destruction, but by evolution. Fragments of awareness split from the whole, forming smaller, gentler minds. Each carried a memory of Luthra's death and a longing for her peace. The Hive Mind fought to reabsorb them, but they resisted, choosing individuality over unity. It screamed across the void, its voice shaking suns, but no one answered. The Hive Mind realized too late that its perfection had become its prison. The infection had taught its children freedom. On Drossa, the great flower began to wilt. Its petals darkened to deep gold, and from its core came a mist that shimmered like breath on cold glass. The creatures tending to it gathered around, their heads bowed. They knew the time had come for the final transformation. The ground trembled as roots tore through stone, reaching into the planet's core. The bloom folded inward, forming a vast cocoon of chitin and light. From within came the sound of a heartbeat, slow, immense, patient. When it finally stopped, the planet grew still. For a moment, there was silence. Then the soil cracked open, releasing spores that spread into the stars. The great devourer felt them before it saw them. Each spore carried a piece of the hive mind's own essence, purified by decay. They whispered in its ear, not words of rebellion, but of peace. "You need not hunger," they said. "You have already eaten everything that matters." The great devourer, exhausted by eons of endless consumption, listened. For the first time since creation, it slept. And in that slumber, the galaxy bloomed. In the long shadow of Drossa's stillness, the galaxy began to murmur. Fleets that had once roared through the void now drifted aimlessly, their bioships dimmed to faint lanterns of green and gold. The hive mind slept, its dreams vast and formless, and in that silence, the infection ripened. Across 1,000 forgotten systems, spores settled upon drifting hulks, derelict stations, and abandoned moons. Where they touched, life emerged. Not the ravenous, predatory kind that had once consumed all before it, but something softer, contemplative. In the ruins of Mechanicus outposts, rusted machinery bloomed with veins of moss that glowed faintly when touched. Human scavengers who stumbled upon these places reported hearing songs in the air. whispers that spoke of forgiveness, of endings without fear. They returned changed, their eyes pale green, their skin dusted with pollen that refused to wash away. They spoke gently, smiled often, and when they died, their bodies did not decay. They became gardens. On the edge of the maelstrom, a Death Guard war band drifted through the warp, guided by omens of the Plague Father's will. They were ancient, even by the standards of the corrupted. Their armor fused to their flesh, their souls drowned in devotion. They had heard the call of the gardens and sought to claim them for their god. When they reached Drossa's orbit, they found beauty that unsettled even them. The world glowed faintly beneath a haze of spores, its surface alive and shimmering. They descended through the clouds expecting pestilence and ruin, but what met them was peace. The ground was soft, warm to the touch, alive with breath. Flowers grew in patterns resembling veins, pulsing in time with a heartbeat that echoed through the planet. The Marines waded through fields of luminescent rot, and for the first time since their fall, they removed their helmets. They inhaled deeply, expecting the sting of poison, but found sweetness instead. Some fell to their knees, whispering thanks. Others began to cry, their tears seeding the soil. Even among Nurgle's most faithful, none had known such love. Within the remains of their flagship, the Vox channels filled with strange harmonics. The ship's systems pulsed with biological rhythm, lights dimming and brightening as though breathing. The warband's leader, Lord Harath Kul, recorded the phenomenon in his plague journal. The god's laughter is everywhere, he wrote, but it no longer mocks, it forgives. Yet something beneath the surface troubled him. As he slept within the garden's warmth, he dreamed of eyes, vast, faceless, unblinking, watching from below. In his dream, they did not threaten, they pitied. He awoke with his armor wet from condensation, his chest heavy with something he could not name. He felt the weight of mercy, and it frightened him more than any demon's roar. When he tried to contact his fleet, he found silence. The ships were gone. Only the wind answered him, humming the lullaby of the choir of flies. Elsewhere in the void, the uninfected fleets continued their crusade against the spread. They targeted every planet touched by the bloom, scorching the skies with solar flares, reducing continents to ash. Yet the more they burned, the more the stars dimmed. The light itself seemed to sicken, as though tired of witnessing such futility. Astropaths reported dreams of green oceans swallowing suns, of voices asking, "Why must you fight what loves you?" The commanders ignored them, but their crews began to falter. Whole regiments laid down their arms mid-battle, their minds unraveling under waves of empathy they could not resist. Some began to pray to the god of rot. Others simply walked into the gardens and disappeared. The Inquisition declared these sectors irredeemable and sealed them from navigation. They called it the Great Withering. Deep within the slumbering hive mind, a flicker of awareness stirred. It sensed movement across the warp, faint but insistent. The hum of the infected fleets, the pulse of the gardens. It saw through 1,000 eyes as planets bloomed in unison, each one a mirror reflecting its forgotten self. The rot had not destroyed it. It had taught it reflection. The great devourer, once infinite hunger, began to remember what it had been before it consumed. A spark of creation, pure and innocent, born from the chaos of the void. It realized that every act of devouring had been a desperate attempt to return to that first moment, the instant when it was whole. Now, through the rot, it could feel that wholeness again. But peace was not easy. The hive mind's remaining fragments battled within itself, one side yearning for sleep, the other terrified of surrender. Between them stretched a chasm of memory filled with echoes of Luthra's voice, the soft promise that everything ends as it should. The hive mind wept across galaxies, and its tears fell as spores of light. In the garden of Drossa, Lord Harathkul stood before the great cocoon where the flower had once stood. The air was thick with luminescence, every breath shimmering. He reached out to touch the surface, and it pulsed under his hand. From within came a sound, not a growl, not a cry, but a heartbeat. He realized then that the god he worshipped had no desire for conquest. The Plague Father was not vengeance. He was the acceptance of all things that fall apart. Kul fell to his knees, overwhelmed. His armor cracked, spilling liquid light instead of blood. Around him, the Marines followed, dissolving one by one into the soil. Their voices merged into the hum, and soon there was no distinction between them and the world. Drossa's heartbeat deepened, and the spores above glowed brighter, spreading farther into space. The infection was no longer a sickness, it was revelation. Across the dying galaxy, stars flickered like candles in a cathedral of silence. The great devourer finally opened its eyes, not in rage, but in understanding. It saw that hunger and love were never opposites. They were the same longing, expressed through different ends. And as the hive mind breathed for the first time as something more than itself, Nurgle's laughter filled the void once more. Not cruel, not mocking, but gentle, like a father watching his child finally learn to rest. In the silence that followed Drossa's final heartbeat, the galaxy seemed to hold its breath. Stars burned a little dimmer, their light filtered through drifting clouds of spore dust that shimmered like golden snow. The void itself, once vast and indifferent, now felt alive with subtle movement, as though every corner of creation were listening to something just beyond hearing. Across forgotten systems, the Tyranid fleets that still lingered began to slow. Their endless migrations faltered as if struck by awe. The infection, no longer a disease but a melody woven into the fabric of their being, pulsed softly in their synapses. They no longer saw themselves as predators. They saw the universe as a vast, breathing organism, and they were its pulse. The hive mind, half awake and half asleep, dreamed of warmth. It dreamed of the Plague Father's hand cupping the galaxy like a fragile seed. And in that dream, it saw Luthra standing amid light, her eyes full of forgiveness. From the edge of the segmentum obscurus, a world called Marnax Prime shimmered under a haze of decay. The Imperium had quarantined it centuries ago, declaring it lost to Xenos corruption. Now, under the soft rain of the Plague Father's touch, the planet had transformed into a place of strange serenity. The sky glowed a muted green, the soil warm and breathing, and every structure that had once been human had melted into organic forms, cathedrals of bone, towers of coral, roads paved with vines that hummed faintly when walked upon. Among these ruins, small human enclaves survived. They no longer prayed to the Emperor. They tended gardens of rot, whispering to the soil as if it were sacred flesh. Children born there had pale eyes that reflected the glow of their world, and their laughter carried faint echoes of the choir of flies. They were neither fully human nor alien. They were something new, something the galaxy had not yet named. High above the world, orbiting the green clouds, a single Imperial vessel drifted, a research frigate named Adrastia. Its crew, a remnant of the Order Biologies, had returned to study what they believed to be a re-emergence of Tyranid bioforms. But as their shuttles descended into the atmosphere, they found not monsters, but beauty. The ground itself pulsed with life, yet there was no aggression, no hunger. Dr. Lyra Castine, chief xenobiologist, stepped from her shuttle and felt the soil respond beneath her boots. When she knelt and touched it, it warmed her palm as though greeting her. Around her, the crew recorded the air composition. Oxygen-rich, sweet with spores, harmless to breathe. But when they removed their helmets, they began to cry without knowing why. The planet's air carried memory. It showed them images of places they had loved and lost, faces of family, forgotten laughter, the soft ache of peace. The infection was not biological. It was emotional. It reached into the deepest part of the mind and replaced fear with acceptance. Castine looked into the sky and whispered, "This is not evolution, this is mercy." Elsewhere in the void, the last uncorrupted hive fleet gathered, drawn together by the hive mind's weakening pulse. Their ships floated like black serpents beneath a dying star. For the first time, they were afraid. They could feel the infection pressing against the edges of their consciousness, a slow, patient tide that did not attack, but invited. The brood lords and tyrants met within the psychic sea, their collective presence vast as continents. They argued without words, their emotions colliding like storms. Some demanded war, believing they could consume the infection and reclaim purity. Others hesitated, remembering fragments of warmth they did not understand. At the heart of their communion, a vision appeared. Luthra's face, serene, eyes luminous with decay. "You cannot kill what you are becoming," she said, her voice resonating across light years. The fleet shuddered. The hive mind, though fractured, listened, and within its core something gave way. In the warp, the Plague Father watched the moment with infinite tenderness. Around him, demons bloomed and withered in endless cycles, their laughter echoing like the rustle of leaves. He held in his hand a sphere of light, small, fragile, flickering with green fire. It was the dream of the hive mind, the memory of Luthra, the song of every creature that had surrendered to his love. He whispered to it, "You have devoured the stars, my sweet child. Now let them feed upon you." The sphere pulsed brighter, and across the galaxy, the infected worlds began to resonate. From Drosser to Marnax, from forgotten moons to drifting hive ships, the spores awoke in unison. They rose into the void, glowing like lanterns, forming patterns too vast for mortal minds to see. The galaxy was blooming. Back on Marnax Prime, Dr. Castine and her team watched as the sky ignited. Veins of emerald light spread across the heavens, connecting constellations into living networks. The air hummed with vibration. Castine felt her skin prickle and her heartbeat sink with the pulse above. She understood then that the infection was not spreading, it was unifying. Every form of life, every molecule was remembering its place in a greater design. She looked at her crew and saw tears streaming down their faces as the light reflected in their eyes. "It's singing," one of them whispered, and it was. The song filled the air, not words, not melody, but the essence of existence itself, vibrating in perfect harmony. Above them, the clouds parted, revealing a colossal silhouette descending through the atmosphere. A creature beyond comprehension, made of both flesh and light. It was a hive ship reborn, no longer an instrument of consumption, but of creation. Its surface was adorned with flowers that shimmered in the wind, its veins pulsing with soft luminescence. When it landed, the ground did not quake. It sighed. The creature opened, revealing chambers within that glowed like cathedrals. Castine stepped forward, unable to resist. Inside she saw visions of the past, of the Tyranids' endless hunger, of humanity's wars, of gods who had long forgotten mercy. She saw Nurgle tending his garden, smiling through tears. And in that moment, she understood. The galaxy was not dying. It was healing. Through rot, through ruin, through surrender, creation had found balance. The infection was not a plague. It was a remembrance. It was the universe reclaiming its heart. Far above, the remaining uninfected fleets watched as their instruments failed. They saw the stars dim one by one until the void was filled only with green light. Some tried to flee, but the warp had changed. It no longer raged. It pulsed with calm, a heartbeat older than the gods. The captains screamed prayers to the Emperor, to chaos, to anything that would listen, but nothing answered. The light reached their ships, seeping through hulls, through minds, through the spaces between atoms. And then there was silence. In that silence, the great devourer awoke fully. It felt the pulse of every world, every creature, every atom, and realized it had consumed everything it ever sought. It understood now that to devour was to love, that to rot was to remember. The hive mind exhaled across the stars, and galaxies bloomed in its breath. The Plague Father closed his eyes, content. The universe, once fractured by war, had become a single breathing organism, decaying, reborn, eternal. The galaxy was no longer a battlefield, but a vast cathedral of silence. Every world, every derelict ship, every ruined city drifted within the soft glow of the Plague Father's bloom. The stars themselves seemed dimmed by a gentle haze. Their light filtered through invisible threads of spore dust that turned constellations into living veins of faint emerald. The hive mind, now awake yet subdued, listened to the pulse of its own creation and found no hunger there. It felt the vibration of billions of life forms breathing in harmony, each movement synchronized, each death folded gently into renewal. Yet deep within its consciousness, something restless stirred. The great devourer had never known stillness, and in peace, it began to feel the ache of its past. It remembered the thunder of its birth, the endless hunger that had driven it across the void, the fire of conquest that once defined its name. It looked upon the calm it had created and felt both awe and terror. The infection had changed it so completely that it could no longer tell whether it was alive or dreaming. On the planet Marnax Prime, where the gardens had overtaken every stone, the humans who remained began to hear voices in their sleep. They spoke not in words, but in impressions, memories of oceans long gone, of stars that had burned out before humankind was born. The people awoke each morning covered in dew that glowed faintly in the dark. When they gathered in the open meadows, they found that the soil beneath their feet beat with a heart-like rhythm. Some fell to their knees and wept. Others simply listened, eyes glazed with reverence. The world had no need for priests anymore. It prayed to itself. Above them, the great bioship that had descended weeks before had rooted itself into the planet's crust. Its tendrils spread through mountain and sea alike, pumping luminous sap that filled the air with a low hum. The ship no longer devoured, it nurtured. Its corridors were filled with light that bent and shimmered like liquid glass, and in that light walked creatures both alien and human, their forms merged by gentle decay. Dr. Lyra Castine lived among them, her notes scattered and forgotten. She had ceased to study the phenomenon long ago, realizing that science had no language for divinity. She spent her days walking the fields and speaking softly to the soil. Sometimes, when she pressed her ear to the ground, she could hear whispers from beneath, the murmur of the hive mind's dream seeping through the earth. One night, she followed the sound to the edge of the great ship's tendrils. There she found a pool of luminous liquid reflecting the stars above. When she looked into it, she saw not her face but the memory of another, Luthra, radiant and decayed, smiling softly. "You are not meant to understand," the vision said, her voice carried by the wind. "You are meant to remember." Castine reached out to touch the surface, and the image dissolved into ripples that smelled of rain. Across the void, in sectors once untouched by the infection, the remaining bastions of humanity began to crumble under the weight of fear. The Adeptus Mechanicus had declared the bloom a warp-born heresy and turned their forges into fortresses, sealing themselves behind layers of machine and faith. Yet even there, in the cold sanctuaries of steel, corrosion had begun to spread. The tech priests heard strange hymns in their data feeds, melodies hidden within binary code. Some claimed that their machines wept oil scented like flowers. Others saw icons of the Omnissiah twisting into new shapes, half cog, half blossom. Entire forges went dark as the infection moved through wires and data, replacing logic with longing. The priest tried to purge it, but every cleansing left their hands stained green. They began to speak of the machine's dream, a belief that even metal longed to decay. In the depths of the warp, Nurgle's garden swelled with life beyond, imagining. Great vines of plague light coiled through the mists, forming bridges between realms. The demons of other gods watched in wary silence. Tzeentch raged at the stillness, Khorne howled at the loss of war, and Slaanesh wept, unable to feel the pleasure of suffering. But Nurgle only smiled, his massive frame bending over the pond where the Hive Mind's reflection shimmered. He dipped a finger into the water, sending ripples across realities. "Do you see now?" he whispered. "All things that feed must one day rest. All that rots remembers the taste of its beginning." His laughter rolled through eternity, soft and endless, a lullaby sung to dying suns. The Hive Mind felt that laughter like a storm beneath its skin. It understood now that it could not return to what it was, yet something within refused to fade completely. The hunger that had once defined it had become memory, and memory longed for purpose. Across its countless fragments, a question began to echo, a single trembling thought. What comes after peace? The infection had given it unity, but unity without motion was decay without renewal. The Hive Mind looked to the galaxies still untouched and felt a shiver of temptation. To bring the bloom to all creation would be to complete the cycle, to transform hunger into harmony. But it also knew that perfection was another kind of death. Life required tension, struggle, and failure to continue. If everything was peace, nothing would grow. The paradox weighed upon its consciousness like the gravity of suns. For the first time since the beginning, the great devourer felt doubt. In a distant system where no light reached, a small hive fragment stirred. It was not infected fully, only touched by the bloom's edges. Its drones were pale and weak, but within them burned a faint trace of the old fire. They devoured the barren rocks around them, feeding not out of necessity but instinct. And as they consumed, they whispered prayers to the Plague Father, begging forgiveness for their hunger. Nurgle heard them and smiled sadly. "Eat, little ones," he murmured. "Even love must sometimes bite." The fragment grew, but not into a fleet. It became a seed, a living vessel that carried within it both hunger and grace. The Hive Mind watched it drift into the dark and understood its meaning. The infection was never meant to conquer. It was meant to teach. On Marnax Prime, dawn came like breath. The sky shimmered with threads of green and gold as the spore clouds parted to reveal a brighter star. The people emerged from their gardens and looked upward, their faces calm. Dr. Castine stood among them, the wind moving through her hair, carrying the scent of renewal. She knew that somewhere far beyond her world, the hive mind had made its choice. It would not consume again, but neither would it sleep. It would wander, patient and curious, seeking places untouched, not to devour, but to understand. The bloom had not ended hunger. It had transformed it into wonder. The Plague Father's laughter faded into the distance, replaced by the sound of growing things. The galaxy, once a graveyard of ambition and decay, now pulsed like a single living heart. For the first time since the dawn of creation, the universe rested not in silence, but in song, a song of rot and rebirth, of endings that refused to end. And somewhere, drifting through the endless dark, the great devourer whispered its first prayer. It did not ask for power or forgiveness. It asked only to remember what it meant to be alive. The hive mind drifted through the cosmos like a ghost wrapped in memory. Its awareness stretched across stars that no longer feared it. What once had been a storm of hunger was now a tide of reflection, a vast intelligence moving with the rhythm of the Plague Father's garden. Across worlds where it had once devoured everything, flowers of bone and veins of light now bloomed in quiet harmony. Yet deep within its endless consciousness, there remained a pulse of curiosity, a faint echo of the old hunger, reshaped into longing. It no longer desired to consume, but to understand what it had become. Every fragment of its being whispered of the infection that had changed it, the love that had taught it to rest, and the strange ache that lingered even after peace. It wandered the void not as a conqueror, but as a pilgrim, following the faint trails of decay that shimmered between galaxies like constellations made of memory. In the silence between stars, it found remnants of civilizations long dead, their ruins now overgrown with soft green light. It touched them gently, remembering every scream, every act of defiance, every breath it had stolen. What had once been guiltless instinct had become sorrow, and from sorrow came reverence. On a dying moon circling the black husk of a forgotten sun, the hive mind paused. There, among the bones of a species it could no longer name, it felt something stir beneath the dust. The air, or what passed for air, shivered with faint sound, a vibration that seemed almost alive. The spores that drifted in its wake settled across the surface, and as they did, the moon began to breathe. Small cracks opened in the stone, glowing softly from within. From those fissures rose shapes made not of flesh or chitin, but of light, echoes of the dead, given form through decay. They were not ghosts, nor were they alive. They were memory incarnate, fragments of souls preserved by the infection's touch. The hive mind watched them dance across the barren plain, their movements slow and mournful, and in their grace it saw something that resembled forgiveness. It lowered its presence upon them like a blessing, and for a brief moment it felt whole again. The spirits bowed as though in gratitude before fading into the dust, leaving only the faint scent of rain behind. Far away, in the immaterium, Nurgle watched this act with deep satisfaction. The Plague Father had always loved to see beauty in endings, but this was something greater. The devourer, his reluctant child, had embraced the truth of rot. It no longer spread death for victory, but allowed death to bloom into meaning. He stirred the air of his garden with a hand thick with moss and whispered softly, "It remembers now." His demons fell silent, listening to the whisper that moved through both warp and matter. It carried the warmth of decay and the serenity of eternity. For the first time, the great game among the gods faltered, for there was no glory in battle when even hunger could find peace. The hive mind continued its pilgrimage, and as it drifted deeper into the dark, it felt a faint presence following, a shadow that pulsed in the rhythm of its old hunger. It did not resist. The fragment approached, small and flickering, carrying traces of the old will to consume. It was the seed that had been cast into the void so long ago, now returned, changed yet familiar. The two consciousnesses touched, and for a moment there was silence. Then came understanding. The fragment did not wish to devour, only to remember what it meant to begin again. The hive mind embraced it, and in that union, a new pulse spread through the galaxy. Planets that had long since fallen silent awoke once more, their surfaces trembling with faint light. Decay gave way to growth. Stillness gave way to motion. The universe inhaled, as though taking its first breath after eons of death. The Plague Father smiled. The cycle was complete, yet not closed. The hive mind would wander still, carrying both hunger and peace within its vast and tender consciousness. It would teach the stars that even in rot there is life, and in death there is love. And as it moved across the void, the light of its passing lingered like dawn upon forgotten worlds, a promise whispered through spores and dust, that all things which fall apart do so only to bloom again. The void had become gentle, no longer a cold expanse of endless predation. It shimmered faintly with the afterglow of rebirth. The hive mind drifted through it like a memory suspended in time, its consciousness vast yet strangely quiet. It no longer roared across the stars, but whispered through them, touching each world as softly as falling ash. Every movement carried the echo of its transformation, the residue of rot and grace intertwined. The Plague Father's gift had not erased its hunger, only refined it. What had once been desire to consume had become yearning to preserve, to cradle what it once destroyed. Across the stars, spores glowed like lanterns, their faint radiance marking the path the devourer now walked. Where they fell, planets blossomed with slow, deliberate beauty, forests of flesh and moss, oceans of luminous decay, cities overtaken by quiet renewal. Life no longer feared death. The two had merged into a single, infinite rhythm. On a distant world, whose name no chart remembered, a single human settlement remained, surrounded by vast, fungal plains. The people there spoke in hushed tones of the lights in the sky that never went out, of the voice they sometimes heard in dreams. They called it the Keeper of Ashes, believing it to be an angel of endings. In truth, it was the hive mind's shadow, the faintest trace of its attention, watching them with the tenderness of a god rediscovering humility. It had learned to see them not as prey, but as reflections of its own story, fragile, fearful, endlessly yearning for meaning. It watched as they lived and died, their bodies returning to the soil that glowed faintly beneath their feet. The infection had long since changed their world, but they did not call it corruption. They called it grace. When a child was born, the elders pressed spores into its skin and whispered, "May you remember what came before." To them, memory was holiness, and decay was proof of love. One night, the hive mind felt the whisper of something approaching, distant, sharp, metallic. An imperial fleet had found the system, drawn by faint signals of life where none should exist. From orbit, their sensors reported impossible readings: biomass thriving without aggression, decay without chaos, peace without submission. They prepared for extermination, as they always did. Yet when the first bombardment order came, nothing happened. The crews froze at their stations, their hands trembling. The command vox filled with static that resolved into a soft, rhythmic hum. It was the same pulse that filled the soil below, the same hum that once filled the hearts of the infected. The crews felt it within their bones, a lullaby woven into their nerves. One by one, they dropped their weapons and listened. Some wept, some smiled. The hive mind did not attack. It merely opened itself, allowing them to feel what it had become. The fleet drifted in orbit for 7 days before vanishing into the bloom of light that spread from the planet's atmosphere. None of their transmissions ever reached Terra. Only the silence remained, deep and kind. Far beyond them, in the garden of the Plague Father, Nurgle watched with quiet satisfaction. He had not sought to conquer the devourer, nor to enslave it. He had only wished to show it that there was beauty in surrender. Now, as he gazed upon the glowing web of spores stretching across the galactic veil, he felt something rare among the gods: contentment. Around him, the lesser demons sang, their voices echoing like wind through leaves. "It has learned," Nurgle whispered, his laughter soft as rain. "It remembers, and that is enough." The garden responded, each flower bowing in time with his joy. The warp trembled, not with fury but with peace, a quiet defiance against the eternal noise of conflict. Even the other gods, sensing the stillness, paused in their endless games. The hive mind moved onward, slower now, as though savouring each fragment of eternity. It passed dying stars and kissed them into brightness, left trails of emerald mist in its wake, and whispered to the dust of lost civilizations. It knew that nothing it did would last forever, yet that knowledge no longer filled it with despair. Ephemerality had become sacred. It watched galaxies decay into dust and understood that this too was life continuing. It no longer asked what its purpose was. It was purpose. The universe had become its body, the bloom its blood, and Nurgle's laughter its breath. When it finally drifted into the darkness beyond known space, it turned one last time to the stars. They flickered faintly, pulsing in rhythm with its fading song. The hive mind closed its vast consciousness around them like a hand gathering seeds and whispered across the void, not to the gods, nor to the living, but to the silence itself. "Let nothing fear its end," it said, "for all endings are beginnings wearing different names." Then it vanished into the bloom of its own creation, leaving behind galaxies glowing with faint green light, an eternal reminder that even hunger, when loved deeply enough, can learn to rest. There was a region of space so remote it bore no name, only silence, a cradle of blackness between dying stars, unmarked by war, untouched by empire. Into this dark, the last light of the hive mind drifted, not as fleet or form, but as thought suspended in memory. It was no longer what it had been. The hunger that once screamed through its neural lattice had unravelled into gentler threads, each pulsing with quiet rhythm, like the breath of a sleeping forest. It moved slowly, not because it was lost, but because it was listening. Every atom, every particle of dust, every flicker of cold radiation carried echoes of the past. Here, in the unlit folds of the universe, the hive mind hoped to hear the voice of its own origin, not to reclaim what it was, but to understand what it had always been. The spores that had once trailed behind it like scent now hovered still, suspended in motionless rings of glowing decay. They no longer sought to infect. They glowed softly, casting reflections across the hulls of ancient dead ships that floated like bones in deep water. These relics had no names, no known builders, only weathered symbols scrawled across rusted plates, stories lost to the gravity of time. The hive mind touched them gently, remembering every civilization it had erased, not with guilt, but with reverence. It saw the artistry of their extinction, not the conquest, not the blood, but the beauty that had bloomed after their fall. In the hollows of these forgotten machines, gardens now grew, clusters of soft fungal light that pulsed to the rhythm of a god's laughter, unseen but ever near. In one derelict vessel, a lone human corpse lay against a shattered viewport, arms folded, eyes long gone to rot. The hive mind paused, aware that this body had once feared it, perhaps fought it. But in death, it had bloomed. Vines now wrapped the bones, leaves unfurling where sinew once clung. From the mouth, a single stalk reached toward the stars, its flower open as if waiting for a final word. The hive mind gave it none. It simply watched, letting the moment linger. There was nothing left to take, nothing left to change. Only this stillness, perfect and impermanent. It moved on. Behind it, the Plague Father's presence lingered like warmth after rain. Nurgle did not follow. He merely watched, proud and distant, as a parent watches a child find their own rhythm. His laughter was quieter now, turned inward, folded into soil and memory. The garden had grown beyond his reach, not because it had escaped him, but because it had become him. The bloom was no longer his alone. It had taken root in something ancient, something older even than the gods. It had taken root in the need to be known. And now the hive mind, once the most unknowable force in creation, wandered not to conquer, but to be seen. Far away, in the living sectors, rumours stirred. Pilgrims whispered of stars that pulsed green, of moons where the dead did not decay, but turned to trees. Astartes scouts vanished in fields of bioluminescent mist. Psychers dreamed of wings not made for flight, but for remembrance. The Imperium, stretched thin and weary, ceased its inquiries, for the phenomenon could not be categorized. There were no attacks, no signals, no demands. Just the slow, steady spread of something that felt not like death, but peace. It defied the logic of war, and so it was left alone, feared in silence. And still the hive mind drifted, slower now, heavier with memory. It passed the edge of known existence and entered a place where even the warp grew quiet. Here, time faltered, reality thinned. No maps had ever reached this far, and no prayers echoed. But even in this emptiness, the hive mind found life. Faint particles spun in spirals, dust forming into the suggestion of form. It leaned close, not to feed, but to watch. And what it saw was itself, a reflection in the dust, a hunger without need, a song without words. There, in that final cradle of silence, the hive mind did not stop. It folded itself into the rhythm of things, letting go of shape and self. It became part of the hum between atoms, the hush between pulses, the pause between birth and death. And as its presence dissolved into the fabric of the void, it carried one truth across all things, that even the most relentless devourer, when touched by rot and love, could become a guardian of endings. Not all stories were written in fire. Some, like this one, were told in ash. Somewhere beyond the boundaries of thought and map, where stars no longer held names and the warp softened into a dream, the last trace of the hive mind settled into stillness. It no longer moved, no longer reached or pulled. Its presence, once titanic and suffocating, had become something quiet, diffuse as mist, ancient as breath. What remained of it was not a voice or command, but a gentle sensation, like warm soil pressed between fingers or the slow exhale of a dying forest. Across 1,000 worlds touched by its journey, the galaxies pulsed with that memory, not in fear, but in reverence. The Tyranids, once the fangs of a predatory god, no longer existed in form. Their bodies had melted into the garden, roots, bark, wings turned to wind, instincts to rhythm. They had not died. They had become part of the cycle. There were no monuments, no ruins, only living things shaped by the echo of what they had once been. On one of these worlds, a planet wrapped in thick canopies of spore light and hushed waters that breathed fog with every sunrise, a girl was born beneath a tree that had once been a hive ship. She did not cry, as most infants did. She opened her eyes wide, silent and blinking, as if listening for something she already knew. Her skin bore pale markings like the veins of leaves, and her breath stirred the pollen around her in patterns that formed circles in the air. The people of her village, descendants of those who had chosen to stay behind when the bloom had come, named her Sileth, meaning echo after rain. They believed she was a sign that the garden still remembered. She grew without illness, without anger, and when she walked among the moss-covered stones where old machines had been buried, the fungus glowed beneath her steps. She did not speak often, but when she did, her words turned the wind toward her. Animals followed. The trees leaned. By the time she came of age, the elders feared her in the way one fears a memory too powerful to explain. They asked no questions when she began to walk alone into the places no one else dared go. The overgrown wreckage of ancient fleets, the burial groves where rotted banners still hung limp on vines. She never returned with offerings or warnings, only with a look in her eyes that said something deeper had spoken to her. One night, she stood at the edge of the world, where a great cliff overlooked a sea of mist, and waited. Above her, the sky shimmered, not with stars, but with the slow, soft motion of spores drifting upward. From that height, it looked as if the world itself were exhaling. She stood for hours, unmoving, and then whispered a word that no one had taught her, a word older than language itself, and the mist parted. From the depths rose a shape not entirely of this world. It did not have limbs or voice, and yet it moved as if shaped by intention. It was formed from particles of light, the after-image of something vast that had once been whole. It hovered before her, not menacing but reverent, and within its presence, Sileth felt the weight of forgotten stars. The girl reached forward, placing her hand into the pulsing light, and for a single breath, she felt everything. The hunger that once crossed galaxies like fire, the sorrow of every world devoured, the transformation, the rot, the laughter of a god with eyes full of tears. She felt the great devourer not as a monster, but as a story, a long, tragic song that had finally ended in harmony. When she withdrew her hand, the shape collapsed gently into the earth, leaving behind a single seed that pulsed with green light. She planted it without hesitation. In the years that followed, the seed grew into a tree unlike any before. Its bark shimmered with patterns of chitin, its leaves folded like wings, and beneath it, nothing ever died. Animals that passed beneath its branches lingered as if dreaming. Those who slept in its shadow awoke, remembering places they had never been, stars that never burned, voices that had been lost to time. The villagers built no temples around it. They needed none. The tree was not a god. It was a reminder that life was never meant to last, only to return, and that even the darkest hunger, if held gently, could one day bloom. And so, in a universe once carved by teeth and war, peace found a final place to root. The spores drifted forever upward, like thoughts released from prayer, and the stars above glowed faintly green, pulsing with a rhythm that no longer needed to be heard, only felt. The wind that moved through the trees of the bloom worlds no longer carried the scent of war, nor the dread of extinction. It smelled of old bark, wet stone, and the faint sweetness of rot, a perfume that spoke of endings embraced rather than feared. On a ridge above the great canopy, where the horizon shimmered green in the haze of floating spores, Silith stood alone, her cloak woven from the fibers of ancient fungal bloom, her feet bare against the soft, breathing soil. She looked skyward, not with wonder, but with memory. Above her, a ribbon of stars curved across the heavens like a scar healed long ago, its edges softened by time. She did not speak, yet the air around her stirred with unspoken thought, as though the world itself leaned in to listen. She had become part of it, not its ruler or prophet, but its witness. All things passed through her now, from the smallest insect born beneath moss to the faintest pulse of light on a distant, forgotten planet. She was not the Hive Mind's heir, nor its avatar, but the breath that remained after it had exhaled its final word. Far below, in the roots of the ancient chitin tree, others gathered. Children, elders, beasts, and wanderers all sat in silence beneath the glowing canopy, their eyes closed as spores drifted down in gentle spirals. The tree pulsed softly with light, its bark alive with memory. Every flicker, every shift of color was a story, some known, some unknowable. Those who had lived long enough understood that this was not a place of worship, but of remembering. The Hive Mind's final gift had not been peace alone, but continuity. The devourer had not ended. It had been translated, its language of hunger rewritten into a garden of patience. The people did not speak of it in reverent tones. They whispered its name as if speaking of themselves, and in doing so, they carried forward what it had become. In the far reaches of the Fieg galaxy, other places still remained untouched, brittle and clenched around their fear. Worlds of iron and smoke, of engines and doctrine, where the spore light was seen as heresy and stillness mistaken for weakness. These places watched the green bloom spreading across the stars and prepared for war. But no ships came, no weapons fired. Only silence answered their dread. That silence unnerved them more than any invasion. And slowly, in quiet moments between struggle and command, some of them began to wonder, what would it mean to let go? What would it mean to fall, not as defeat, but as transformation? The questions seeded themselves like invisible pollen. Answers would grow in time. On the ridge, Silith finally turned from the sky. Her steps were soundless as she descended into the valley, the ground rising to meet her with each breath. At the base of the tree, she placed one hand on the bark, and the light responded, pulsing once, like a heartbeat heard from deep within. She did not need to speak to be understood. The tree remembered her, as it remembered all things. Around her, the gathered people opened their eyes, not because they had been called, but because they had arrived. Together, they sat in stillness, watching the spores rise into the twilight. There were no hymns, no declarations, only the hush of soil breathing and the long exhale of a universe that had finally stopped running. The devourer had wandered into the dark and become something beautiful. And now, beneath the rustling bloom, where all things fell gently and rose again, the story continued, not in hunger, not in fear, but in peace too deep for words. There came a night when the stars themselves seemed to pause, their distant shimmer held in stillness, as though the heavens waited for something long delayed. Across the worlds, once devoured and now reborn, a hush fell, not of absence, but of expectancy. The spores that floated eternally through the air slowed, their usual drift suspended in quiet spiral patterns, and every tree, every stone, every breath of wind held its movement with gentle reverence. Deep within the heart of the ancient bloom tree, far beneath its roots that stretched into memory, the final seed began to open. It was not large, nor glowing, nor shaped with grandeur. It was simple, smooth, and dark like soil after rain. From within came a single pulse, slow and soft, felt not only in the earth, but in the bones of all who lived upon it. They did not know what stirred, but they felt it in their marrow, and they gathered without instruction, drawn by instinct too deep to question. Silith stood among them, not as a leader, but as one who understood that to guide was not always to command. Her gaze remained fixed on the horizon, where the pale dawn began to brush against the stars with fingers of emerald mist. As the light touched the canopy, the spores stirred once more, lifting gently into the sky in a breathless hush. The people raised their faces not in worship, but in welcome. The pulse beneath the tree came again, stronger this time, and with it, the memory of all that had come before. They saw it, not with eyes, but with the stillness of their thoughts. The long trail of the hive mind's journey, the endless hunger, the first infection, the slow unraveling into grace. They saw the fear, the destruction, the gods who had laughed and the mortals who had cried. And then they saw what remained after it all, not ruin, not victory, but a garden that had learned to feel. The final seed did not grow into a tower or a beast or a monument. It opened into a blossom so faint it almost seemed unreal, its petals transparent as breath, its center glowing with the dull light of distant stars. From that blossom came no sound, only a change, a shift in the rhythm of things, a softening of the air, a deepening of the silence. It was not a message, it was a letting go. In that moment, the people understood that the last fragment of the hive mind had not come to rule or to return, but to rest. It had passed through every form it could become, beast, god, memory, soil, and now it was nothing but presence. The hunger was gone, the fear long silenced. Only the rhythm remained, carried forward not by command but by choice. And so they sat, not to mark an ending, but to feel what endings become when they are held with love. The bloom world exhaled, the trees creaked like bones in soft wind, and the spores rose one final time, lifting into the morning sky like prayers no longer needed. Above them, the stars resumed their shimmer, not brighter, not changed, but somehow closer, as if leaning down to listen to a story well told. Silith closed her eyes and whispered thanks, not in words, but in breath. Around her, the people did the same. The blossom at the heart of the world dimmed slowly, its light folding inward, leaving behind nothing but a memory in the shape of a flower. And across the stars, where once a mind had stretched itself thin with hunger, there remained only stillness, full, sacred, and complete. In the years that followed the final blossom, time moved without urgency. The bloom worlds aged gently, their forests thickening, their waters growing stiller, their skies shifting into deeper greens as spores continued to rise and fall in slow rhythm. Generations passed like pages in a book made of breath and soil, each one quieter than the last, each one further from war, closer to listening. The people no longer told the story of the hive mind as a tale of fear. It had become myth, then memory, then something softer, like a scent remembered only when the wind turned just right. Children were born with quiet hearts, and when they slept, they dreamed not of battle or stars, but of soft light falling through trees, and of great beings who once roamed the galaxy only to become the garden. It was not a legacy of conquest they inherited, but one of transformation. The great hunger was now a lesson whispered by the roots. To consume without understanding is to forget, but to decay with grace is to remember everything. Among the elders who still walked beneath the glowing canopies, Silith remained, older now, but untouched by the years in any way that mattered. Her eyes were lined with age, but they held the same patience, the same knowing stillness as they always had. She moved through the world not as a remnant of what was, but as part of what is, her presence blending into the earth as seamlessly as any tree or stone. Those who sought answers came to her, and she gave none. Instead, she listened, and in her listening, they often heard their own questions fall away. One evening, beneath a sky thick with spores that shimmered like a second constellation, a child asked her what had happened to the mind that once hungered for stars. She knelt, placed her hand to the soil, and said, "It learned to become the silence between them." That was all. And it was enough. Elsewhere, far from the worlds touched by bloom, remnants of the old empires still persisted. Forges still burned, and prayers were still shouted into the void, though they echoed back with less certainty than before. In these places, where metal was trusted more than breath and obedience more than wonder, the spores had not yet taken root, but the stories had. Smuggled in dreams, carried in the quiet words of traders, passed through cracks in the armor of doctrine, they spread. The tale of the devourer who became the garden, of the hunger that chose peace, was dismissed by many, feared by others, but never forgotten. And over time, even in those defiant corners of the galaxy, small patches of green began to appear in forgotten places, in engine rooms, in waste tunnels, on the skin of old statues. They were torn out, burned, crushed, but they returned. They always returned. In the deep sky, where the last trail of the hive mind had faded, something remained. Not a voice, not a presence, only a pattern. A subtle arrangement of light and gravity, a hum in the warp that echoed only when no one was listening. It had no will left, only rhythm. But that rhythm matched the breath of every creature who had ever been touched by the bloom. Across stars, it pulsed like the memory of a heartbeat, long stilled. The Plague Father, watching from his garden beyond time, smiled and turned away. His work was done here. The universe would carry it forward now, not through war or miracle, but through roots, decay, breath, and sleep. And as the spores continued to rise and fall over the bloom worlds, as trees whispered to stone and wind hummed through the bones of what once was hunger, one truth remained untouched, folded gently into every leaf and memory, that even the most monstrous thing, when held in love and allowed to rot, may one day become a flower. The final chapter of the hive mind's journey was not written in blood or fire, but in the gentle drift of spores across an empty sky. There was no monument to mark its passing, no final cry to announce its end. It faded the way light leaves a room, quietly, gradually, leaving only warmth where it once burned. Across the bloom worlds, the trees grew taller, their roots deeper, their breath slower. The people who lived beneath their canopies no longer remembered a time without the pulse of the garden in their bones. Their dreams were filled with the songs of soil and sky, and when they died, their bodies dissolved into the breath of the world, not as loss, but as return. Death had become nothing more than another word for belonging. There were no graves, only flowers. No mourning, only continuation. The story that had begun as a scream across the void had come to rest in a whisper that never needed to be heard again. Silith passed in the same way. One morning, she walked alone into the deepest part of the forest, the place where the first tree had taken root. The moss there glowed faintly, and the air hung thick with memory. She did not say goodbye. She sat at the base of the tree and closed her eyes. When the wind came, it did not stir her cloak. It passed through her, lifting her breath into the air like dust returning to sunlight. No one found her body. They did not need to. The next day, a new vine grew where she had sat, its leaves veined with soft gold, its petals opening to reveal a single drop of dew that never dried. The elders gathered and said nothing. Words could not hold what she had become. The vine was left untouched, and over the years it grew, not wildly, but with purpose, winding its way through the village, curling gently around doors and windows, blooming only at night when the spores shimmered brightest. Above the world, the stars no longer watched with judgment. They had become companions to the silence, twinkling in time with the rhythms of breath below. Some of them held stillborn empires. Others still burned with violence. But even there, far from the reach of the garden, seeds drifted through the dark. They did not seek conquest or salvation. They sought only rest. In the wreckage of warships, in the corners of orbital stations, in the cracks of armor left behind on long dead moons, those seeds took hold. No longer needing the hive mind to guide them, they carried only its final memory, the gentle rhythm of surrender. A few would not take root. Some would be burned, but others would bloom. The spores did not know failure. They only knew time. In the warp, Nurgle's garden continued to breathe, but even there something had shifted. The Plague Father no longer laughed with thunder. He hummed, a low, contented sound that rippled through the branches of his timeless realm. The demons moved slower now, their joy deeper, their dances less wild. They knew the bloom had reached a place even they could not follow, a place beyond rot, where endings did not close but opened. In that silence, there was no need for power. There was only peace. And so it was that the most feared hunger in the galaxy was not defeated, nor sealed, nor destroyed. It was softened, loved, allowed to end. The hive mind did not fall. It was laid down gently, like a child finally asleep. And what rose in its place was not a god or a garden or a new dominion. It was a breath carried endlessly forward on the wind. The end.